Hi, I am Paris. In this video, we want to provision Azure Kubernetes Service or AKS managed AAD or Azure Active Directory integration cluster. AKS managed AAD or Azure Active Directory integrated service simplifies the Azure AD or Active Directory integration. It's necessary to create an Azure Active Directory group as administrator for the cluster, AKS, Kubernetes cluster. We would go through the steps later in Terraform. And in the previous version of AKS, we needed a client and service app were required with directory read permission. In this version, the AKS provider manages it for us. The question is, how is the Azure Active Directory authentication? In AKS managed Active Directory integration, the Azure Active Directory authentication is provided to AKS or Kubernetes cluster with the OpenID Connect. Cluster administrators can configure Kubernetes role-based access control or Kubernetes RBAC based on user's identity or directory group membership. As each service has its technical limitations, we have some limitations here as well. AKS managed AAD integration or integrated cannot get disabled after it is enabled. Changing an AKS managed AAD integration or integrated version to legacy is not supported. Cluster without Kubernetes RBAC enabled are not supported for AKS managed AAD integration. There are some additional items that we should consider, and they are the minimum version of Helm and kubectl command lines. But what we would do in this video, we would deploy AKS managed Azure Active Directory integrated version via Terraform. I would use the environment variables for Terraform, tenant ID, subscription ID, client secret client ID to deploy my Kubernetes cluster. I want to simulate the same scenario or situation for you when you are deploying a cluster via your CI/CD pipeline, because the challenge after integrating AKS service with Azure Active Directory is non-interactive logging for the CD part of your pipeline. And then we go through the steps, the code implementation together. On the right side, I have my Azure portal. On the left side, I have my Visual Studio Code. I have two most important Terraform implementation or folder in this video. The most important part is where I provision the cluster, and the interesting part is where I define the module of my AKS. As you see here, I used Terraform modular implementation. Maybe I go quickly through my implementation. I have even a repository for naming convention. I let a repository or Terraform implementation generate a name for me with a specific naming convention that I deployed in this Terraform code in this repository. As you see, I use a PAT. It is only for my usage, therefore I used my personal access token in my URL. It shouldn't be the same for you. It is my private implementation only to provide these videos for you. Then I have a module for resource group, a module for creating a cluster registry, Azure container registry. Then creating a container registry, manage identity name, manage identity object, AKS name, AKS node resource group name, and Kubernetes cluster on Azure. The implementation is modular. I take the output values from the previous provisioned resources and configure my AKS implementation. The important or interesting part is it is my module, Kubernetes module implementation. Maybe you have already this implementation in your company, in your project. The most important part for this implementation is Azure Active Directory role-based access control definition or resource here, where I say it is managed. Managed here is for AKS-managed Active Directory integration. Here, in this case, in this video, I would answer this value. I would assign true value to this variable. Admin group object IDs is the object ID of Azure Active Directory group for Kubernetes cluster admin. Azure RBAC enabled in this scenario that right now I'm presenting to you is false. But I would cover this attribute later in another video. It's because of the local RBAC, local accounts of Kubernetes to close the backdoor. And the tenant ID is a tenant ID of course, this Azure Active Directory group. In some scenarios, can be that a project needs two Azure tenants, one for Kubernetes cluster admin and one for the user who want to call the application of this applications which are running on this cluster. But it's not the focus of this video. I will talk about it in a later video. Let's continue with the implementation. We talked about the attributes. Then you see that I defined a variable. It is an object type. You can see in my input. I have a list of input variables which are important for my cluster when it is provisioned. One of them is AAD config, which contains the 4 important variables that I need for this video. Let's go to the modular implementation. You see I have AAD config here. For manage the attribute, I would say yes, true, because I want to use Azure, I want to provision cluster which support manage the AAD integration, and it is the object ID of my Azure Active Directory group, and here is my tenant ID, and the answer here is false. I would cover this attribute in a separate video to explain why it should be true, why it should be false, what are the advantages and disadvantages. In this video, I won't go through the other attributes, but if you have any question about Kubernetes implementation or network infrastructure of the Kubernetes, let me know. Then I would provide a video and answer your question. Now that we talked about the implementation, the result of this implementation or this configuration, you can see on your Kubernetes, on cluster config, here you see that Azure Active Directory group has been mentioned here. Kubernetes local account has been checked. It's because of the false here. And I have selected Azure AD Authentication with Kubernetes R back. It's important that you see the same configuration. When you provision a Kubernetes cluster with Azure Active Directory integration enabled, you have one challenge for your CD part of your the pipeline, because when you call, let me go to my bash file. I provided a bash file here. Because when you call your AKS get credential, the command prompt is changed to ask the user to do the browser sign-in. But it is not a suitable sign-in method for CD pipeline. CD pipeline, in most of the time, is a service principal. And service principal in the middle of the CD pipeline execution cannot do a browser sign-in. Therefore, you need a non-interactive sign-in method. To call AKS get credential to get a credential of the Kubernetes cluster, let me resize the window. Actually, you need such an implementation. You have to log in with your service principal on your build agent, for example. The service principal ID or client ID, client secrets, tenant ID, I provided in my environment variable. Then you can call the get credential because, and I added my service principal to Kubernetes Azure Active Directory group, which I defined as Kubernetes admin group. It means this service principal that I want to log in here with is a member of this Azure Active Directory group to be able to get credentials. And extra, I installed Kubernetes kube login to convert my kube config to SPN or service principal, SPN of the service principal, to be able to call the kubectl get node. Let us go through the steps, because in this line I can get a credential, but this credential doesn't still know with which user I want to log in. Then after I use convert kubeconfig, then the credential of the service principal will be saved in my config file. And when I call the kubectl get node, then I can get a node of the cluster. Maybe you ask, what is that here? Because I want to manipulate or change my config file to be able to log in a non-interactive way, I decided to download the config file in a specific way, and this variable here, kubeconfig, is important when you want to call the kube login convert kubeconfig, because this command looking for this variable and to find the config file, the path to the config file. It can be any path. I decided to use a simple path, but it doesn't mean that you have to say to use the same path. Now I want to show you how this bash file would work. I go back to my modular implementation. It is the rest of AKS config. Maybe interesting for you as well. I deployed or provisioned my Kubernetes cluster with user managed identity, user defined managed identity. And then I should give ACR pool permission or role to this principal ID. Maybe you ask how I know what is the principal ID. Actually, you can see in my output file. I assign the user defined managed identity, but I extract the object ID from here. And the cluster ID for another position or implementation. Then I see that I give the principal ID of the cluster even virtual machine contributor role on node resource group. Of course, they can be developed or implement as a child module, but I wanted to do it directly in my main file here. I provided null resource implementation to only get credentials. Or maybe non-interactive call. What do I say here? I say, yes, I want to call this file, execute this file, run always with timestamp, always it will be called. And then I pass two variables here, resource group and resource group name and AKS name to the file. And the file implementation or bash implementation is as follows. I take the two variables, the order of the variables must be in the same order that I pass the values to the file. I set the environment variable, and it's important if I'm writing a bash file here, then I have to run it in my local machine in a bash environment or on my build agent where I execute my pipeline. It should be bash environment as well, or a Linux environment. Then I go through the steps. But first, I go to my enterprise AKS implementation and I do Terraform init because I activated this module right now, this resource right now. Therefore, first I have initiate the Terraform. And then I do Terraform. Maybe I wanted to make it visible for you actually. I can bring it here. Then Terraform apply. As you see, the local exec As you see, I have defined a non-interactive bash file. Local exec is calling my bash and pass the two variables to the bash file. The bash file is logged in with a service principal, and let me hide my credentials. And then after get the credential, the command convert cube happened, and then I can get the node which is running on the cluster. I think it would be the whole for this video. If you have any question, you can write under my video. I will answer the question. And if you have another questions about the infrastructure or another implementation, I would provide a video for you. Thank you for your time and watching this video.